Seja bem-vindo e bem-vinda ao nosso canal. Este evento é organizado pelo Escritório da UNESCO no Brasil. Ele discutirá questões relevantes para todos e cobrirá uma das 5 áreas do mandato da UNESCO: educação, ciências naturais, ciências humanas e sociais, cultura, comunicação e informação. Contudo, esclarecemos que as indicações de nomes e a apresentação do material ao longo deste evento não implicam a manifestação de qualquer opinião por parte da UNESCO a respeito da condição jurídica de qualquer país, território, cidade, região ou de suas autoridades, tampouco da delimitação de suas fronteiras ou limites. Assim, as ideias e as opiniões expressas neste evento são a dos participantes e não refletem obrigatoriamente as da UNESCO, nem comprometem a organização. Acompanhe os canais da UNESCO para outros eventos e ações da organização.
Good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to have you with us today for this lecture by very good friend Arjun Appadurai. All of you know very well Arjun Appadurai. I will not present him. He will talk about discipline and disciplines in the contemporary university. This is an event supported by Caixa Geral de Depósitos in the auditorium. We are Auditorium Rui Vilar, and I want to thank Caixa Geral de Depósitos for this support. Also by UNESCO Brazil, which is broadcasting and translating this lecture to all the world. And of course, to the University of Lisbon. The rector of the University of Lisbon is here with us. Thank you very much, Luís Ferreira, for being with us. The Dean of the School of Education, Luís Miguel Carvalho, which is also with us, and they are the main responsibles for this UNESCO share on the future of education. And it was precisely in the International Commission on the Future of Education, created by UNESCO in 2019, that I had the pleasure to work together with Arjun Appadurai and creating links and bonds that conduct us to this lecture today. We are all very happy and very excited to listen to Arjun Appadurai, one of the most brilliant thinkers of our time. I will not stay with more words. I will give the floor immediately to Appadurai. Thank you very, very much for your kindness, for your generosity, and for accepting to be with us today here in Lisbon. Thank you, Arjun. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Thanks. I must begin with a few words of thanks on my side. First of all, indeed, to Antonio, who I sometimes call Antonio, sometimes call my dear ambassador, my dear rector, my dear colleague, many things. But I'm very pleased to be able to have built a friendship with Antonio Novoa, who most relevantly was indeed responsible as the Portuguese ambassador to UNESCO for steering this remarkable report on the future of education, which I think is the backdrop and background to this series of lectures in which I'm very honored to also have a part. And of course, the fact that he was earlier in his career the rector of this remarkable university, of which I have known for a long time, adds to my pleasure about this context. And of course, I'm grateful to this important bank, which has made its facilities open to this lecture. All of this is a great delight for me, and I should add an apology that you have to operate today because of me in English. I wish I had some capacity in Portuguese, but in spite of the fact that I grew up in Bombay with a lot of connections to Goa, they did not include education in Portuguese. So my Portuguese is very minimal, but I think it's of course one of the most beautiful languages to listen to, both in its Portuguese forms and Brazilian forms. So anytime I'm here, it's like I'm listening to something musical. But I have been to Lisbon and elsewhere in Portugal a few times due to the generosity of various friends and institutions for more than 20 years. So I feel like I have some sense of Portugal, of Lisbon in particular, and of its special place in the European context. I now live in Berlin after many, many, many years in the United States. So I'm in the European mix and aware both of its shared issues as well as the big differences from Sweden to Portugal, that it's a very diverse, a little bit like India. And before I start reading from my written remarks, I should say that there will be a fair amount about India in this lecture. And that's not evident in the title, because the title is about some general issues. But India, which is my original country of origin, but is also the place on which I do a lot of my research and writing, more or less from the beginning of my scholarly life to today. So India is always on my mind. And that will become clear today, but I hope it will illuminate some bigger issues. The other thing which the title does not reveal immediately, and you will see very quickly, is that there's another word in addition to disciplines and disciplinarity, or discipline and disciplinarity, which is going to come up a lot, and that is the word diversity, even more common, the long history. So I just alert you to the fact that these two things are not in the title that I originally gave to Antonio. So with that caveat, let me read, and I hope Antonio will do me the favor of maybe flagging when I have, say, 5 minutes left or 3 minutes, and everything like the accordion can be closed.
Okay, I will do it.
So it could be argued that disciplining India's diversity was the central problem of the British Empire in India. The ruling classes from Britain needed Indian collaborators who were not just employees, but faithful replicas of their British rulers. This collaboration gave birth to all the great technologies of British rule in India, notably the map, the census, the trigonometric survey, and the endless parade of gazetteers, statistical reports, and memoranda about the Indian population in every aspect of its variety. Michel Foucault has shown us that these great technologies of rule were part and parcel of the rise of the modern nation state in Europe, where the idea of population, geography, or the ideas of population, geography, and sovereignty were mutually reinforcing techniques of what he called governmentality that marked the end of prior royal and religious ideas of sovereignty. In India, these techniques were expanded by the rudimentary techniques of anthropology, archaeology, and historical writing, which were designed to tame India's exotic cultural worlds. The university in colonial India was above all a disciplinary setting in the full Foucauldian sense, for it was intended to forge a class of Englishmen, Indian Englishmen, to tame India's own excess of diversities and also to bring imperial peace to India after the uprisings against the British in 1857. And universities are, the great Indian universities, literally to the year, start in the late 1850s, after the suppression of the last great revolt against British. It is, of course, true that these universities did not quite develop in the way that their founders might originally have hoped. Over the century and a half since the major Indian universities were founded, they have evolved in a series of unpredictable ways. In one regard, they have followed the original plan, and that is in assuring the hegemony of the English language in all areas of Indian literary, cultural, political, and public life. The Indian languages, especially Hindi, but also Tamil and various others, have certainly expanded their role in parliamentary politics and even more in the print and television news media, as well as the highly popular cinema and song worlds. But they have all but died, basically, in the worlds of teaching and research. So in these other worlds, you might say non-English languages are living a very rich life. But in the worlds of teaching and research at the university level, they have all but died. Sanskrit, which most of you know as the great classical foundational language of India, is all but dead as a serious arena of scholarship. Hindi, the national language, and all the regional languages have barely got a functioning cadre of teachers and scholars who know anything but the modern version of these languages, and that too superficially. Indeed, as my friend and great student of language and literature, Sheldon Pollock, has recently argued, there is now a class of teachers and scholars in Indian universities who are connected to neither the Anglophone scholarly world nor the world of their own regional languages. As far as the regional languages are concerned, there is, of course, a vital world of literary writers, of poetry and prose, as well as of critics who keep these languages alive. But there's very little cross-translation across these Indian languages, and hence they do not support a vigorous continental universe of publishing and criticism. Where the regional languages, especially Hindi, Tamil, and a handful of other languages, such as Telugu, Malayalam, and Bengali, have retained a major life, as I said, is in the twin fields of politics and media, where they have worked together to create a plebeian world of stars, glamour, power, and gossip. These worlds have almost no connection either to the university or to the critical literary sphere. This is a grave state of affairs which leaves English as the only language in the Indian subcontinent which provides links between news, fiction, politics, and policy. And thus its most sophisticated speakers, that is, sophisticated speakers of English, are still able to monopolize many forms of power in India. Its lesser practitioners, meaning people who know some English but are not super sophisticated English, are simply cogs in the machines of these various spheres, job holders, rather than trendsetters or innovators. From this point of view, the famous fantasy of a British administrator called Macaulay for the Indian university system, which is that it would create a class of Englishmen and create a library more superior than the vast Indian regional libraries. This is the Macaulay fantasy. These have certainly not come true, insofar as English now controls only a small part of the Indian public sphere and provides a sort of thin contact pigeon between a variety of other elites, such as film stars, politicians, businessmen, and holy men, who largely operate in regional linguistic spheres with their own regional following. So right now, some of you know that India is having its major election. It's already 2 weeks. It's going to go on for another 6 weeks because the country is so huge. One of the things going on in this election is the dynamic between people who have regional followings in regional language, regional influence. How are they going to work in building a consensus at the level of Delhi and the nation, where English is like this thin umbrella? So, what then have the Indian universities in fact accomplished? Above all, they have been degree factories, which have massively increased the ranks of the educated unemployed in independent India. The path from most Indian universities to the top rank of research institutions, corporations, industries, and cultural elites is steep and narrow. The eye of the needle is still a handful of older universities, such as the universities of Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru University, the University of Calcutta, and a few others, as well as the well-known institutes of technology called the IITs, and then the institutes of management called the IIMs, and a handful of more recent private imitators of these institutions, about which I'll say a word in a second, the new privates. Some portion of the products of the Mufassil, that is regional, local universities, do get into the national and state civil services, the armed forces, and the variety of public service careers in the railways, the customs, the tax services, etc., but usually in the lower level officer ranks. On the whole, the numerous local or regional smaller universities do not offer gateways to national careers for their graduates, and at best are the basis for regional elites and networks. For those who fail to graduate from these places, what awaits them, as I say, is even lower careers in bureaucracy or on the edges of the formal economy. I mentioned the new private universities. I just say a quick word about them because they have not yet completely changed the landscape that I'm describing. But there are today in India about 200 universities which are less than 15 years old. And that's a big thing because they have been created largely by private money, family money, corporate money, or entrepreneurial money. And they have been enabled by the availability of land given to them in almost all cases by state governments and state politicians who control these lands and can give 20 acres, 30 acres, 50 acres, 100 acres to these universities, who then seek other funds beyond their family funds to compete as privates in a world which was largely a world of public universities. So this is a new phenomenon in India, one which I'm very interested in, but it's not yet created a dramatic change in the broad environment that I'm describing, which is a kind of thin layer of English uniting people at the top, the kind of creamy layer, and then all kinds of other power, glamour, celebrity, and frankly, electoral corruption, politics going on in and through the regional networks, which then pump their resources up or receive resources from the top. But that's the multilinguistic world, but the English world is still regulating the top in Indian credentialing and in the window to the West. So many of you might know that the chief executives of at least 2 or 3 of the biggest Silicon Valley giants, Google among them, Microsoft also, are from India. So they are people who have come from relatively modest backgrounds, gone to these high-powered IIMs, IITs, which are government-supported, performed extremely well, been recruited to Western universities, ended up in California and become not only parts of Silicon Valley, where there are hundreds, thousands of such Indians, but top people in the world. Satya Nadella and Sundar Pichai among them, really masters of the universe for almost any youthful Indian interested in technology, science, engineering, computers. These are superheroes, rightly so. But they depend on a huge public investment in education for a century or more. So I often say to people that I meet who are very smart computer engineers, mathematicians, IT guys, often, almost always, much younger than me, say, please remember, you began this race with a 99%, 99-meter advantage in the 100-meter race, provided by public funds. Yes, you worked very hard, you competed, etc., but the entire playing field, the entire conditions of the race were set by public investment. You didn't educate yourself. You didn't study in a garage. You studied at the IIT, IIM, you then went to Caltech on some scholarship. It's public money from India that moved you up and out. But that's a slightly separate story. So most analysts or commentators in India are alarmed about the relatively small number of university graduates in India, but even more about the shortage of university graduates with the right skills for the 21st century. This skills debate is overwhelmingly about jobs and skills needed for the current world economy. And Antonio and I and our colleagues in the UNESCO report spent a lot of time thinking about this phenomenon. It is not about critical thinking, ethical reasoning, or broad knowledge of history and society. It is about employability. And it is about employability conceived quite narrowly in current technical and economic terms. There is broad agreement that India has a major and growing skills gap. But the gap is defined by the fact that the object is to be employable in the current IT-dominated world. That's the principal objective. And India is seen to have two huge advantages. One, English language, which goes fairly far down, even though it's not people writing novels or doing literature. They have some English. Take the contrast with China, where to this day, the biggest effort in China is getting young students to know English, to write English, to learn it. That is not that much of an issue in India. The other is that the youth population in India is huge. The total population is 1.4 billion. So minimally, you could say this global youth employment market is 300 to 400 million, easy, of youth. So the question is, how do you deliver them to the world skills market? That is the dilemma that all these universities are struggling with. So you can see that it's easy for them to forget about broader education, liberal arts education, resilient education for the future, etc., because the temptation is, look, the world will need, and they're right about that. The world will be looking for global employable youth with the right technical and linguistic skills in the hundreds of millions in the decades to come. India has the hundreds of millions. And it has a lot of tech training. So the feeling is we're almost there. Just close the gap and boom, we'll pluck all the cherries from the tree. Well, it's of course not so easy, you see, because at the same time, India has become a poor cousin in basic research in the sciences and technology. There's been some very good work on why this falling behind in basic research. Even the people working at the very top of the IT world, including these CEOs who go from India to Silicon Valley and then come back often to India to create new businesses, they are not working at the outer edges of AI, ChatGPT, nothing. They're working at the low end of the value chain, and everybody in India knows that. So why? You are a country of brilliant engineers, mathematicians, physicists, statisticians, not one or two, hundreds. And yet you are not adding high value. That is still dominated by the US. Not even Europe is at the cutting edge of the new developments in computer technology, IT, and so on. India, definitely not, although it has a big piece of the market downstream, coding languages, programming, all that. But that is not the high value stuff. That is not where the unicorns are. So that's a separate story, but in other words, there are still some very difficult challenges for India to resolve. So let me switch, having just said something about the challenge of universities and of discipline and disciplining India so that its diversity is not a source of chaos, but can feed into the global market, push development up, make India a global power. These are well-known public goals. Let me switch to diversity. So even without recourse to the dictionary, it is possible to see that diversity is a tricky word. At first glance, it suggests plenitude and an infinity of possibilities. There is something to this implication, even if the dictionary will not directly sustain it. Today, diversity is a word, and that's been true now for 20, 30 years, that contains all the force, all the contradictions, and all the anxieties, in this case of a specifically American, that is US utopianism. Let us call this a utopianism of the plural. To my knowledge, the story of how the idea of pluralism enters American social, political, economic, academic thought has yet to be written, but I think it's a 20th century idea, this idea of pluralism. And my own pet theory is that it comes out of political science. And political science is a lovely field, but it's entirely made in America. It's fully made in America. There is politics, political thought, these have big histories in Europe, England, and so on. But political science, this is the 1920s. It's a made in America product. And pluralism becomes an issue out of that infant science. Now, the connection, whatever the story may be with the idea of pluralism, it feeds into the idea of diversity, which as a slogan encompasses the strong fascination with the plural. Now I'm thinking particularly of the US, and you can see how far this has come into Europe. And the even stranger idea that plurality and equality are deeply intertwined in a democratic society. The folk view that biological diversity is a good thing creates a good part of the energy that animates debates, especially in the early part of this millennium, after the year 2000, about multiculturalism. Notice, of course, multiculturalism had disappeared, but nobody is against diversity. In fact, in the US, I can offer you as a footnote, that the single biggest religion of the university administrations of the US is, have you heard this acronym, DEI? Diversity, equity, inclusion. If you stand up in a room like this and say, I'm against DEI, you will be in very serious trouble. It's very young, it's very recent, it's major. The idea behind it is a good one, that we need diversity. Diversity is part of inclusion, equity. It's an industry. This is the American way. Today, a good idea, tomorrow, an industry, day after, careers, after that, corruption, and then the idea dies. Then the next one rises. And they're not bad ideas. Please don't misunderstand me. I've been struggling for diversity in the curriculum and in admissions and all for decades. But I had not anticipated that DEI would become a major obsession. In the last few weeks, it's been overshadowed, of course, in the US by two things. One is the horrendous situation in Palestine, which has now entered US campuses in a major way, as you know, so nobody's anymore talking about DEI, and the Trump situation. Those two things are hogging all the media. But DEI is not gone. But lots of people are trying to shut it down, and I must say I'm ambivalent about that. Because the people who want to shut it down are typically right-wing politicians. But I'm ambivalent about it because I think the thing has become no longer a value animating the spirit of life, but an industry, a career-based industry, which allows a lot of avoiding of the issues. please go to Title IX officer, please go here, please go there. So presidents, for example, of American universities, by the way, of which there are about 3,000, 1,500 universities, about 1,500 liberal arts colleges. It's a beast. It's huge. Those people are now extremely careful, and now they've been dragged, kicking and screaming, into giving opinions about Palestine, about student protests. They don't want to. They would love to be hidden, out of sight, but no. They are being dragged into the daylight and forced to pronounce, and always alienating half the audience. Alienating the donors, but pleasing the politicians. Alienating the politicians, but pleasing the students. Pleasing one part of the students, but not the other. So anyway, university presidencies in the US are not at the moment the top desirable jobs for people with the right qualifications even. So the point about diversity that I want to make, the main point, is that over the 30 to 40 years that I've been in American universities, throughout, there has been no good answer to one fundamental problem. What is the relationship between intellectual diversity and cultural diversity? That is population diversity. We must have people who are, from impoverished backgrounds, from racially discriminated backgrounds. We must do all that. We must bring them in. That is cultural diversity, let us say, or you could call it even social diversity. But intellectual diversity means you have to read a lot of things. You cannot only read about the history of the United States from 1900 to 1950. You have to read more history. You have to read about the history of other parts of the world. The US has never found a solution to that. How many books do you need which are from, India, China, to have a basic liberal arts education? I could ask the same question here. I don't know, in the University of Lisbon or other great universities in Europe. How much, even in translation, are people obliged to read from somewhere else? Answer is, there's a limit. There's a limit. You can't have 400 classical works in Chinese to be read by undergraduates. It's not possible. Especially when the top 500 is already defined by works from, Cervantes to Joyce, or from Plato to, somebody else. The bus is full. Where are you going to put the other books? On top, underneath? It's a challenge. But it's a challenge which is not without solution. But that challenge has been kind of given up. Why? Because separate departments are created. You do Asian and Chinese, you do Japanese, you do Latin American, you do this, you do that. India, of course. But don't disturb the main things. When we teach serious stuff, liberal arts and this and that, please don't ask for room on the bus. That bus is full. So the problem has gone away that way, but it's unsolved. But the problem of social and cultural diversity is not going away. Black Lives Matter, the whole movement for reparations, which is very hot in Portugal right now, I gather. These are, and Germany as well, elsewhere in Europe, in the US with Native Americans, all over the place. Not interestingly in places like India and China. Somehow nobody's talking about reparations to anybody, although the subaltern populations have been crushed for 2 millennia. Nobody's worried about their artifacts, who took what from whom. It's not even an issue. So you might wonder, why not? These are a literate society. They're smart, they are hip, they are contemporary. But only in Europe and the US, and in some of their previous colonies, I say some, because there's not a big debate going on between India and the UK about reparations. There's little stuff about don't steal things, don't smuggle, but not about major cultural issues. That's between Africa primarily, and to some extent Native Americans. I don't know about Latin America. There should be a big conversation about that. But it's very difficult to have, of course, if the main thing is silver and gold. These are liquid things. You can't say the statue came all the way from there to here. Although in Germany, I know there are remarkable things in the ethnological collections that came through the German royalty, which had collectors and expeditions in Latin America. So it's not absent, but it's not everywhere discussed with the same intensity. So I just want to say that we need some new thinking about diversity, which connects intellectual diversity and cultural diversity, books and people, or ideas and people, all of which are diverse, but all of which cannot be seen as limitless. You have to have some managerial, limitation that says we can take on this much, but no more. Finally, I turn to the idea of disciplinarity. And I want to say 2 or 3 things about that before I may be challenging the clock. How am I doing, Antonio? How much more time? So I'll pace myself.
Whatever, 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
15. Okay. I'll aim for 15. Discipline is very good, especially for people like me. But I'm very obedient. So I know the nightmare for many audiences, including for me, has been people who have 10 minutes for a paper and then 40 minutes later, I just need 2 more minutes, I'm sure you've all been to these panels. I just need 5 more, but you had 35 more and 6 people are waiting. Anyway, so that is my nightmare in life. So let me go on to the idea of disciplinarity. Now, having set a little bit of the frame about India, the US, diversity, multiculturalism, to say that here again, there is a tension. And about disciplinarity, much could be said and much has been said about the history of disciplines and so on. So I'll cut to the chase and simply say my opinion of disciplines in the academic sense, like in universities. History, political science, physics, math, chemistry, all the things we call disciplines, is they are historical creations which are treated as eternal truths. That is, the minute you have a history department, it'll be the advocates of the history department speak as if history has been a department since the beginning of humankind. But it's, a few hundred years old, and history is older compared to other fields. Like I say, political science, 1920. Sociology, maybe 1850, if you're generous and go back to Marx and Zimmel and so on. So you can play this game in your own head. English literature, I've discovered in the last 20 years, first of all, is young, and second of all, was created mostly in India. The idea of English literature, the canon and these books and this and that was a colonial product. There's excellent literature on this. Right now, you have to take my word for it, alas. But there's great work on this. So it's all short, medium, and a little bit longer. But there is no discipline which has the flag of eternity. Even philosophy or fields like that have the ring of eternity about them, like classics. Well, classics is a modern field. Plato may have gone back a long way, or, Aristotle, but the field of classics has a very definite history of a few hundred years, mainly in England, and with some background, of course, in medieval Europe, etc., etc. But the biggest thing that happened to all these disciplines, which all aspire to eternity, because if you tell them, please work with somebody else, mix with somebody else, what do you mean? We are kind of an eternal thing, The new version of that idea is we are more relevant. So somebody who's working in, let's say, computer science will not say it's been there since Plato, because they know that's plainly false, but they'll say it's much more important. So that argument changes, but the original argument always was, we are a real thing, and the reality is not about us. It's in the world itself. There is a kind of philosophical content there, So the histories are typically short and constructed, but the loyalty is very fierce, and it involves one major organizational requirement. Discipline becomes a department. The day that happens, you can be guaranteed that people will fight to the death. Because it's not a debate about discipline. It's like my department. We were there from the beginning of the university. We should have been if we weren't there, etc., etc. So disciplines, I think, are a mixed good in the sense that their pretense to be eternal is not a good thing, because then it closes all the interactions which actually generate new ideas. So if you look at the 17th century in Europe, did Goethe understand that there was a discipline for him so that he should not write about color? He wrote about theory of color. He was doing physics. Nobody told him that's your hobby. You're actually a poet or something. It is routinely. Everybody in the 17th century had ideas about many things. how apples fall or how poems rise. I mean, they didn't make any lines. So that's all a very recent business. And is part of the history of the modern university, which I won't go into much more, except to say that there is one good thing about it, which goes to the second meaning of discipline, which is that when you localize your field in some way and say, we do philosophy, we do history, we do physics, you are taught some things in a very disciplined manner. That is, you have to know those things in order to get degrees, and I'm in support of that. So it's a very delicate balance in my mind between the discipline that you get by being in a disciplinary department and the sense that its boundaries are eternal. Because even if you look at the sciences, look at a field which I love to think of, like material science. Material science didn't exist. Now it is filled with people from biology, from chemistry, from mechanical engineering, civil, it doesn't matter who. They are all studying materials, polymers, nanotechnologies. That's not a department or a discipline, it's a space of common endeavor. So this is not just for the humanities that we should always mix and mingle as if we're at a cocktail party, you know. It's for the hard sciences. It's always been true of the hard sciences, and it continues to be true. So still and all, if somebody says, I want to go straight into material science, please, I prefer not to do that calculus, you know, it's a pain in the neck. Forget it. Or you want to go into physics, but you don't know anything about the three laws, classical ones. Forget Einstein and all that. That's all, you know, boring. You know, who wants to do that? Well, forget your career in, you know, material science or spectrography or whatever. Forget it. So you do need it, but you have to have some openness at the boundaries and not think of your discipline or your department as a nation state. The boundary is there and we will go to war if this happens, that happens. It's a very unhealthy attitude. But I want to conclude in the last 10 minutes or so that given these realities, and you can see the underlying thrust of my ideas about all these things, is that we have to strike a balance between seeing that things, all the artifacts of our academic world. Certainly, I'm talking about the university and colleges, but you can go lower, you can even go higher to the postdoctoral world and so on and so forth. But the undergraduate and graduate worlds are what I'm mainly talking about. That we need a combination of conscious awareness that all these things that we work with, departments, disciplines, institutions, practices, habits, requirements, exams, all are historical creations. But the biggest problem for me is when, because they are historical creations, doesn't mean they're arbitrary and you can pick and choose from the menu and say, I don't like that, forget calculus, I like Aristotle, I don't like Plato. I mean, you just can't do that. It means you can't go as you like. And I know this sounds banal, but I think it's the biggest dilemma, how to keep all of us, I mean, professors, administrators, students, donors, aware that we need some process to inculcate, to cultivate the meanings of the word discipline, habit, and practice, and techne, and all that, while being aware of the fluidity of boundaries, and in fact, the importance of that fluidity for new ideas. But I'll end with one last thought, and that is a pet idea that I have had, which I have promoted to anybody who listened, from a crowd of 1 to a crowd of 20 for, I would say, 20 years. And that is about the importance of the very idea of research, which, as one colleague said to me when I became interested, he said, notice it is research, that is, search again. That was said in a kind of Zen Buddhist way, so I didn't know quite what to do with that, but it's always stayed in my mind. But my feeling is research has been very, unfortunately, separated from teaching and training. So first step is research has become separate. Second is that research has become outsourced, and especially the American university, which I know best, everybody does research. Have you noticed that the church does its own research, army does its own research, pharmaceutical companies do that. What is a university doing? It's the 15th in the list or the 100th. No self-respecting organization, including the American Medical Association or the Plumbers Union of America, does not have its own research model and expertise. So university has lost its place in the research world. And that means the disconnection from teaching and training is absolute. Google has its own research. It's not looking to universities. It takes people from universities, directs them to what Google wants them to do. More important, and this is what I have really been obsessed with, I have an essay published in some volume 10 years ago called The Right to Research. And it has been my strong view and remains my view that without that becoming a universal right, that means anybody who is, literate, adult, etc., should have the capacity to do research. What is that capacity? To make new knowledge. Right now, if you think of who does research, it's highly restricted. PhDs, labs, universities, and it may not be the university anymore, but it's that kind of person, highly qualified, highly exotic, who then delivers the goods to somebody somewhere. So the whole global project of equity, justice, development, participation in economic welfare and so on is from the start doomed because the people on the ground are not given the capacity to conduct research. So I've been screaming about this for a long time, which I'm still a bit screaming about it. But there's a little more receptivity to the idea that don't think it's just a matter of spreading literacy or spreading, universities or spreading degrees. You must find ways to share the capacity to generate new knowledge. And my view is really almost anybody can be taught how to do an interview, how to define a problem, which is a research problem, which does not include saying the world is going to hell, how can we cure it? That is not a research problem. So as a professor, I've always had to distinguish when people come to me with a research problem that even God can't solve, even if he was given or she 100 years, or a problem that can be solved in 1 week and is not worth a PhD, trivial problem. So you have to find a middle range problem. It take you 3 years, 4 years, a lot of discipline, a lot of effort, a lot of luck, a lot of support, and then you'll have a result. That result will slowly be absorbed. People will not give you a Nobel Prize later for that result, but you'll get a degree for that. You might get a job if you're very lucky. So that capacity is in the university, but out in the real world, in places like I grew up in Bombay and so on, where there are, 8, 10 million poor people, 1 million of them are living on the pavements, etc. But there are nothing stupid about them. They're very smart, huge survivors, but they don't have the tools with which to say, we want to know, we need to know where the jobs will be in our neighborhood in the next 10 years. Well, where are the tools? But they're not that hard, but nobody thinks about. They say, you should read, you should get literacy, you should do this. Well, it doesn't go far enough. So I want to conclude then by saying that in a country like India, I return to India and the effort to discipline India's chaos, diversity, etc., that we have now a huge attack going on the creation of new knowledge itself. In other words, the current regime in India, it's not unlike Trump or Orban or this one or that one, but it's got a very special flavor in India. The answers are known. The answers have to do with being a Hindu and knowing Hindu history and knowing that India is really Hindu and that Muslims are a minority and really shouldn't speak much. So what's unknown? So for this regime, what is unknown is some little technical things in sciences and all, which will be improved, like moonshots and things, by recourse to knowledge which India already has. So no new knowledge is required. So all I'm saying is, in a country like India, but really anywhere, in order to tackle and address the problems of disciplinarity, diversity, and indeed education, we need in a way to bring research, the pursuit of new knowledge, back into the center of the picture, but not in with a very narrow ladder that only when you're a postdoc in some high-level institute are you really free. You can do it from day one. It's not an impossible thing, but that's the note on which I want to end, and I'll stop there. Thank you, Antonio. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
For you, really.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Arjun Appadurai. It was a pleasure to listen to you. We have time for 3 or 4 brief questions. If you want to do it, please do it in English, because we are doing the simultaneous translation into English and Portuguese by the UNESCO Brazil. So if you want to take the floor, probably we have
Somebody right
microphones.
back there.
Okay, back
You see
there.
the lady with her hand up.
Back there on my left. Can we give a microphone?
This lady here.
Hello, I'm Monica. It's a pleasure
Can you please repeat your name? And
Monica. Monica. I'm a teacher, and I would like to know what you think about nature shelters in school, the novelty that's going around, at least in Portugal, making structures that will help reduce peak of temperature and will allow in 2 fronts, helping the planet, helping the schools to be greener and with temperatures low in summer. And I thought about India, that you have also lots of heat, and you are nowadays wanting to have the same conditions that other countries like America have. And are you already doing this kind of things? Because it's also helps. It has, for example, a structure with small shrubs, which makes tunnels, will help children to play and to be creative in their play, and also has been demonstrated to reduce, eu não sei dizer em inglês, hiperatividade.
Giving a wrong speech. So.
Okay.
Hyperactivity, I don't know if it's really the same, and also helps to induce higher levels of concentration. That's what studies in 4 countries in Europe have showed. I would like to know what you think about this.
I get the idea.
Okay.
Shall I
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a comment, wasn't it? Or was it a
No,
question?
I want to know what you think about it. It's nature-based shelters in school.
Well, I think I can answer this easily because it draws on my ignorance so clearly. So I can be very brief to say, of course, this particular thing sounds interesting, but it's not something I know much about. What I can say is your question brings to our attention something I didn't talk about, which is the planetary situation. And that's a very huge subject, but I grew up, I'll put it very honestly, in a time when globalization was the issue. Now planetarity is the issue, so I have to be re-educated thoroughly. So I'm doing that slowly and trying to understand how to put our problems in a galactic frame. Rather, I thought the world was already big enough, but now the world is a small thing in the whole planetary situation. But it's an ongoing dilemma. And I do think very specific, very local solutions and resolutions have to be fed into the bigger picture. And this sounds like one of them. So, of course, I support it.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question? There.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for your talk. My name is Ananda. In your talk, you addressed a large capacity for the globe to produce knowledge from all levels. Could you address the imbalance and privilege of some knowledges over others and how we can tackle that when producing?
Thank you very much. It's a major question, and it's a basic question, and I don't think we have any easy answers. And especially it's for one reason, that I am interested in bringing everybody into the knowledge production game, not just consuming other people's knowledge. Okay, so that's fine. That's already hard because people don't get the idea of why should you do that. But for me, it's very clear. But nevertheless, your question remains. So let's say somebody who's in a subaltern world creates some new knowledge about climate, for example, or about poverty, or about housing, or about shelter. What about the uptake? What about the people who are invested in all the existing solutions, which include pushing poor people out of cities, developing? So there's a lot of existing knowledge which is there to push out the new knowledge. So at the end, there has to be a struggle. And the struggle to me has two parts. One is literally you have to elbow your way into the dominant knowledge to say, look, you can't ignore this. And the people who are serious people on that side will listen to you. People who are corrupt will never listen. But the second thing for me, the toughest problem is that people who are at the wrong end of justice, the wrong end of wealth, the wrong end of class, often, and I'm actually researching this myself in my most recent work on the caste system, which is an old thing, the problem of hegemony. Why do 80% of the population who suffer under the strictures of caste nevertheless buy in? This is a very old question. I'm not the first one to ask him, but it must be answered. And it is another part of this question of multiple knowledges is why do I buy into your knowledge when it's clearly harming me as a class, leave aside as a person? So I have to leave it that way to say that your question is profound, and my initial thoughts are on the lines that I've just shared. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Another question over there.
Hello, thank you for the talk, first of all. And I wanted to ask, I'm doing my master's now, and one thing I have an issue with is finding the balance in wanting my work when I do research to be accessible to the people in Portugal, and doing in Portuguese an accessible language from that. But it feels like either I do that, or for it to be recognized, you're just told you need to do it in English, and you need to do it in a very specific way. And it's more like getting it, I feel like you either try to get into the room where the people that are recognized are through their ways, or you make it accessible to the majority of the population. So, and I feel like the way you talked about language fits into this, and I wanted to ask you how you think we can balance these two sides.
And may I ask, what is your own field or area?
I finished my bachelor's in anthropology, and now I'm studying in environments and sustainability.
And now you're doing what, sorry?
Studying in environments and sustainability.
Thank you. I heard, because my hearing is a little imperfect and acoustic a little challenging for me, so if I miss something, please forgive me. I heard one thing which has to do with, let's say, similar to what the other person asked, which is the hierarchies. So if you produce something interesting, there are always people there to narrow it, blunt it, control it, whatever. Let's say even your advisors or your examiners, that's a kind of vertical problem. But the other problem is knowledge for the public and knowledge for your professional future. That I heard in the kind of second part. If the second is really what was on your mind, I do think that is a challenge that varies from field to field. So let's say if you're in mathematics or physics, it's very tough. I mean, until you're much later in your career and you can go outside of a specific area, the demand for what is new knowledge is so tightly defined that it takes you away from the public world altogether. I mean, mathematics is the best example of this. We literally don't understand what are the objects that they are talking about. You know, rings, bundles. I have great friends in advanced mathematics. I would beg them, please tell me, what do you mean when you say bundle, sheaf, ring? It's like, well, and they have to work very hard because these are super abstract ideas, but they're very specific, precise. But if you're in anthropology, in my kind of spaces, anthropology, media, sociology, then it's a little, I think, more possibilities to do something, for example, on, if you're in politics or sociology, democratic theory, or on citizenship, obstacles to it, how they are met in certain cases. I can see ways where relatively quickly you can put some findings out to people who are activists or journalists or people more close to the front line. Anthropology allows you to go in some way, both ways, I would say, in your space. You can either come and do something which is immediately graspable, something, let's say, on extinction. I have a student who worked on the overfishing of Atlantic bluefish tuna, immediately publicly consequential, but a very sophisticated study. Or, if I may express my own small sorrow, you can go into the extremely now jargony spaces of hypertheory in anthropology, where even I find the titles are all close to incomprehensible. In panels, AAA program. First of all, they all sound the same, and they're all incomprehensible because they involve the same 8 or 15 terms moved around. Now, I feel in saying this, I'm behaving like an old man, because when I was young, people would be saying, you're saying this, that's Geertz, that's Foucault, that's too much, Marx. But now, those are like, simple children's books. Marx, Foucault, this stuff is all around stratospheric, intergalactic. So that part, I think, can be avoided. That's a first step to having wider impact, is insisting that whatever you're doing in the human sciences, shall we say, be reasonably communicable to an intelligent general reader. So that's a very, how to put it, humdrum response. But honestly, it's what I think. I'm trying now. I write for Indian websites on politics and so on. They had 1,500 words, 2,000 words. They don't want any theory of anything, but they're all super smart. They know everything already. So what can I bring to them without writing 2 pages about Max Weber and, Alfred Schutz before? They don't care. They want to say, what's your idea about India today? Tell it to us. So big challenge for me, and I'm facing it now. So you have company.
The last question.
Hello. Thank you for your talk and speech. I want to go back to the making of new knowledge idea. And my question is the academic world, universities, schools, are they prepared to this openness, this fluidity, this diversity, this equity, these inclusions that you're talking about? Or do we need new institutions?
Well, I mean, the nice thing about your question and our kind of conversation is we can talk about basic things like this, as opposed to nibbling on the edges, eating the crumbs and the cake is still sitting there. Honestly, I think as far as the university, and when I say the university, I'm thinking mainly the US. Europe comes because there's a kind of historical following, America invents the best things and the worst things together, always. One day is this, then the next day, the bad version is also immediately made in America. So as far as the university is concerned, honestly, I think in many ways, the horse is out of the barn. Universities really no longer are still, it's like the chicken with the head cut off is still running. So universities are still running. And if you're Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, you do think you are there till the end of mankind, that you began, of course, 200 years ago, but your history will go forever. I don't think anybody's future is guaranteed. Now, why? One, the money factors. Lots of universities are plainly going out of business. There were too many to start out with. Now there's a bloodletting. There is merging. There's the whole online business, which is now replaced by ChatGPT. So even companies like Coursera are now sinking because students are using ChatGPT. They're not interested in Coursera and all that stuff. So the university is under siege. And I think, as I said, research is already fully outsourced. Training is done separately. McDonald's has its own university for training, and certainly Microsoft, certainly the Army, certainly, again, training. So there is liberal arts, in a way, is the last remaining thing. And it is totally embattled because there's no clarity about diversity, no clarity about curriculum. And we have all these mass moral panics, different kinds of witch hunts, lack of courage among the administrators. They want the problems to go away. And right-wing politicians are just walking into this chaos and just like barbarians at the gate, they have crashed through because they see there's total internal chaos. So they're just picking off, saying, you can't do this, you can't teach that, you can't have that person, you can't have this speaker. Why not? So if, I don't know, you watch these hearings of these presidents by the right-wing committee that was questioning them. It was, I said to people, you think it's like the witch hunt of the 17th century? It's actually like the Spanish Inquisition. Does God exist? No, don't give me qualifications, etc. Yes or no? Do you believe in the Bible? Yeah. This is a public hearing in the US Congress of presidents of major universities. They're being asked to confess in the formal sense. Confess. So I do think, in a way, American universities really need a full redo and maybe a complete auto da fe before some new forms will arise. But in other places, I think Europe is an interesting thing because it can go back maybe to an earlier history, because that earlier history is still here. Going back to the 12th century, 15th century, when students were prowling in the streets of cities looking for lecturers, maybe that's not such a bad thing, But places like India, places like Brazil that we're talking about, they don't have to live through all these things. For example, sports. It's the biggest disease of American universities. The amount of money that goes into organized sports, for which then the donors are big supporters, huge salaries. Football coaches, big campuses make 10 times what the president makes. And everybody knows it. So these things don't have to be repeated. So I think there is some reason to be hopeful, but we do have to go back to the basics. What was the point, we need to ask, of putting research, training, and teaching in the liberal sense under one roof? It was called a university. Is it still the right design? And I am certainly prepared to say we need to rethink that, not throw it out, but recombine, reconceptualize. And of course, people fear those things because either they are attached to the original or they hate the original, but want to destroy it and have nothing there, which is where the right wing, I think, is. So that was a long speech, not an answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arjun. I would just quote you, and I will ask you the last question about
Please.
our international report.
Yeah.
And about our international report is said, I'm quoting you, education can help us to design our own transformation rather than to simply react to transformation that are imposed upon us. And then you wrote, to make education the midwife of multiple futures, we may need to embrace uncertainty rather to suppress or avoid it. I would like to have your comments on your own quotes just to end this fantastic afternoon.
In English, there's an old English proverb that says he or she, referring to me in this case, was hoisted on his own petard. I don't even know what petard is. It's something like a flag, but hoisted on his own petard. So you're right to say, I do believe very much in that sentiment. And I do think from that perspective, which is also a deep interest of mine, both the future and the relationship and the question of uncertainty and the so-called unknown, known unknown. I do think we are entering a world where things are changing at a blinding pace, which means that what is unknown is multiplying. The speed of its arrival and its breadth is unimaginable, even 15 years ago. So I do think that the university has to strike some new balance between the older idea of discipline or disciplinarity, which was largely about transmission, that we know a lot and it must be transmitted. But this business, how do we deal with the things that are coming fast at us, cannot be seen just as a handmaiden of communicating what we know. So the question then becomes, what do I need to know in a classroom? Because at the end, it's courses, it's faculty. Who will teach what? I mean, you can't just tell people to think about something. They have to teach something. So my question to myself would be, what can we teach from what is known in order to prepare for what you don't know? That becomes the curricular question for me. And I have some idea about that certain books, certain debates in history showed me that, as they say in path dependency, fork in the road, we went this way, but we might have gone that way. So if I can go back to that moment, teach something about it, whether in the sciences or humanities, maybe that's one way to prepare people for the growth in the proportion of the unknown. But still, we have to start with something we know. Right? So that's the direction of my thought. But thank you for that reminder.
Thank you, Arjun Appadurai. This was the last lecture of our series. I want to thank you very much, to thank you, the Caixa Geral de Depósito, for the support. Also, Diário de Notícias, who was doing the interviews in each of these lectures and of these invited speakers. Also today, with the interview to Arjun Appadurai. Thank you very much to UNESCO Brazil, who is broadcasting all these lectures and translating it for all the world, to the University of Lisbon, to the Rectorate, to the School of Education. And main of my thanks are to all of you that are participating, presential and online. We'll stay in touch with you for the new initiatives of this UNESCO Share. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much, Arjun Appadurai. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Antonio.